ゲームじゃない感じに仕上げたいっていうような、ゲームなんですけどゲームやってたっていう感じよりもなんか違うものが残ってほしいなっていうような感覚ですかね。僕ほら例えばゲームっていろんなものがあるし、スポーツゲームもあればパズルみたいなのもあるしっていう、そういうもののなんていう要素をもう何でもかんでも吸収しちゃうようなゲームなところがあるので、ゲームをしてるんだけれどもいろんなことの体験をしてって最後にその物語全部が集約一つ終わりを迎えるみたいな、そういうような遊びともつかないしゲームともつかないし、何だったんだろうこれは、なんかその疑似体験としてなんか面白いものを経験しちゃったなみたいな、そういう感覚で終われるものになってくれればいいなといつも思ってますね。だからゼルダは何でも吸収できるし、何をやってもゼルダとも言えるし、うまいことをやらないとゼルダと言ってもらえないみたいな変な側面もあるし、なんかね変な不思議なゲームです。はい
Eiji Aonuma's directed Zelda games are the single most over-discussed topic in what is a very short history of video games as artwork. Only a few decades, really. This means that many people, who have no interest in him as an artist, feel the need to form and express an opinion anyway, because it's something they're going to get quizzed on. The reception of the Legend of Zelda games ballooned extremely quickly, almost as quickly as games as a whole, so in the end, like it or not, the intended interpretation of these games is an incredibly important question to ask, especially if you're going to make the argument that any video game should be considered a work of art. Of course, this entire video is also impossible without going over the timeline that you've probably heard a lot about. I did want to integrate things a little better, and I promise by the end of it I will explain everything, but I'd be remiss if I didn't cover the timeline first, and then explain afterwards why it matters. A lot of Zelda fans do intuitively understand a lot of this, but in the end they can't see the forest for the trees, and so all these little details end up getting the same treatment that a fan theory would. So right off the bat, I want to say that this video isn't a theory, this isn't apologetic in any way, and it isn't my opinion thinly disguised as a review. This is simply The Legend of Zelda as intended by Eiji Aonuma. We have a lot of ground to cover quickly, so I figured the best way to do this is to make an example out of somebody, especially since they're so quick to judge us. For this purpose, I'll be using the painfully insipid YouTube critic Matthew Matosis.
The story sets itself up to be a prequel to every other Zelda game to date, but doesn't accomplish anything with it. The most shocking revelation in the game is that Zelda is actually the reincarnated form of the goddess Hylia, a character who had never even been mentioned before until the intro to Skyward Sword. Back in the days of Ocarina and Majora, Nintendo clearly didn't care about crafting an overarching timeline for the Zelda series. Skyward Sword seems like some vapid attempt to start the series, but instead just messes things up even more.
The very first Zelda timeline can be found all the way back in 1991 in this Famitsu article. A Link to the Past is mostly a Tezuka game, but the manual was actually penned by Koizumi. This was just before Aonuma was brought on, and in this manual you get to see a lot of the ideas that Koizumi and Aonuma would work on together in their earliest forms. But I'll just show the timeline here first.
Okay, so you've got Zelda 3 at the top. And then it says the original Zelda makes her first appearance. And then it also says Link's ancestor, ? Then after that it just says Nagai Nengetsu, I think, which is just like a long period of years and months. That's all it is.
It's interesting that Koizumi is saying Link to the Past is a time jump prequel to Zelda 1. Aonuma must have really loved this idea, because when he was brought on, he repeated it. Twice. When we get into later the boundaries of Aonuma's creative control, this will be an important thing to go back over, because it shows the line between what he inherited and how he retooled it to fit his own purposes. In 2002, following the release of The Wind Waker, Aonuma would give this quote in Nintendo Power. "Where does The Wind Waker fit in the overall Legend of Zelda timeline? In terms of the storyline, we decided that this game takes place 100 years after the events in Ocarina of Time. We think that as you play through the game, you'll notice that the beginning of the story explains some of the events in Ocarina of Time. You'll also find hints of things from the Ocarina of Time that exist in the Wind Waker. There's also a more complicated explanation. If you think back to the end of Ocarina of Time, there were two endings in that game in different time periods. First, Link defeated Ganon as an adult, and then he actually went back to being a child. You could say that the Wind Waker takes place 100 years after the ending in which Link was an adult. He says a similar thing in an interview he gave to Nindri in 2006 to coincide with the release of Twilight Princess. Wintact is parallel. Isn't it back to the childhood when Link flies to the world 7 years later at Ocarina and defeats Ganon? Twilight Princess is a world 107 years after a peaceful childhood. In the last scene of Ocarina of Time, Link and Princess Zelda come back as children and have a conversation. It is this story that the story's result is a little dragging, that the relationship between the three with Ganon goes in different directions. In the middle of the work, there's a scene where Ganon is executed. If you leave him alone, he will be executed because he is a sacker to do ridiculous things later. So that scene is a few years after Ocarina. So the executed Ganon was sent to a world, and this time trying to get that power. So no, the timeline was not just made up for Hyrule Historia in 2011. It's something that Aonuma had discussed for 2 decades at this point, and there's all sorts of message boards of fans also talking about the timeline for those exact reasons. And every single bit of that is explained in the games themselves in dialogue. You don't need an art book recapping this information to get this. It's explicitly told to you if you actually read the in-game text.
It starts out on the appropriately named Outset Island with a...
Again, this is not a fan theory. It's just what's in the game.
The more likely answer is this is simply a shoehorned reference to Ocarina of Time, one of many that are in the Wind Waker for seemingly no reason at all. There's no time travel in the Wind Waker, Link has no connection to the previous one apart from his clothes, the game doesn't even take place in Hyrule, not as we know it anyway. Overall, the references to the Hero of Time and all that stuff feel pretty forced, and the Koroks and the Rito are the 2 worst examples.
It's also insane to say that Wind Waker has to feel a certain way in order to be a continuation of the story. Both games take place a century after Ocarina, and Ocarina is constantly referred back to as ancient. The ancient hero, the ancient evil, etc. In fact, Wind Waker is doing that on purpose, because Ganon is clinging to the past while everyone else in the world has moved on, so, he's out of touch with reality. It's kind of the whole point of the story. So, of course, Matthew kind of struggles with that.